All right. Well, good afternoon again, everyone. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you very much for coming to join today's webinar. I am Jason Bonander, and I'm the Associate Director for Informatics and CDC's National Center for Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion. And we are privileged today to have a highly distinguished civil servant, federal executive, with us from the FCC, talking about something extremely important, especially given that it's Cybersecurity Month, talking about essentially the Internet of Things, or as he'll talk about, the Internet of Everything. So who we have with us today is Dr. David Bray. He began his work in public service at the young age of 15, later serving in the private sector before returning to public service as the IT chief for CDC's Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program during 9/11, and then volunteering to deploy to Afghanistan to think differently on military and humanitarian issues, and serving as a senior executive advocating for increased information interoperability, cybersecurity, and civil liberty protections. He completed his PhD at Emory University's Gazette Business School and 2 postdocs, one at MIT and one at Harvard. He serves as a visiting executive in residence at Harvard University, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a visiting associate at the University of Oxford. He's received both the Arthur S. Fleming and Roger W. Jones Award for Executive Leadership, and in 2016, Business Insider named him one of the top 24 Americans who are changing the world. So Dr. Bray currently serves as Senior Executive and Chief Information Officer for the Federal Communications Commission. Through the efforts of a team of positive change agents, he led the transformation of the FCC's legacy IT to award-winning tech in less than 2 years. He rolled out new cloud-based solutions, achieving results in half the time at 1/6 of the cost. He was awarded as one of FCW's prestigious Fed 100 and received the Armed Forces Communications and Electronic Association's Outstanding Achievement Award. In 2015, he was chosen to be an Eisenhower Fellow to Taiwan and Australia and was named the most social CIO globally by both Forbes and Huffington Post. And you can find him tweeting at FCC_CIO. In 2016, he was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum and co-chair for the IEEE committee focused on artificial intelligence and innovative policies for the future ahead. So again, I will turn it over to Dr. David Bray, a highly distinguished speaker, to talk to us today about charting cyber terra incognita, a CIO's perspective and challenges. Dr. Bray.
Thank you, Jason, and it's great to reconnect with the CDC. I can remember about 5 years of fond memories with the bioterrorism program, so I want to thank you for this opportunity to interact and share some of the perspectives of both the challenges we're facing today and, more importantly, what the next 1 to 2 years have in store and how we might address them. So thinking about where we are, it helps to have a little bit of perspective about where we've been. And so the first question that I'd like to ask people is, think about what this is a photo of. And some of you might remember this photo. It was actually taken back in 1990, and it's actually a photo of when Voyager 1 turned around and took a photo of our planet, Earth, 3.7 billion miles away. And it was a pale blue dot, as described by Carl Sagan, and it took 5.5 hours for light to actually be reflected from our planet to actually get captured by the image by Voyager 1, and then another 5.5 hours for radio waves to be sent back to reconstruct that image. And I think it's worth stopping for a moment and thinking about how much the world has changed since Voyager 1 launched, since Voyager 1 took the photo, and where we are today and where we might be in the next 6 years. So when Voyager 1 launched, there were about 4.2 billion human beings on the face of the planet. Global GDP was about 7.2 trillion US dollars. And the Apple II, for those of you who remember, went on sale with a whopping 4 kilobytes of RAM, which probably could play the first maybe 2 or 3 seconds of an MP3 file. And that was 1977. And by the time we actually get forward to where it actually has now traveled 3.7 billion miles for Voyager 1 to take that photo, we're now looking at 5.3 billion human beings on the face of the planet. GDP has tripled. For those of you who remember the 1990s, this thing called Windows 3.0 went on sale for the first time. And there was this thing called CERN, in which a young Tim Berners-Lee launched the first web server ever. Now, you have a bit of a disadvantage because we're doing this over the web. Usually I like to ask the audience at this point in time, how many web servers do they think exist on the face of the planet today? And usually it's estimates between 10 to 100 million. Here's the actual reality. There are more than 1 billion web servers, just web servers on the face of the planet, upwards from 1 back in December of 1990. And what's interesting is the last 150 million only came online since 2013. And so this is not linear change we're facing. This really is exponential change. Now, before I go to where we are today and where we might be, I want to pause at 2013. Because 2013 was a time that probably we didn't realize we made history. And it's only going to be 10 years, 20 years later that we'll look back and realize what exactly happened. In 2013, in addition to 850 million web servers online, there were 7.1 billion human beings on the face of the planet. Again, GDP had about tripled. But more importantly, and what makes this history, was there were 7.1 billion human beings on the planet and about 7 billion global network devices in that year. That was the year in which we tipped the scales where there were going to be, from that point on, more network devices on the face of the planet than there were humans, which is, again, worth thinking about where we've come from 1990 and 1977. There was also 4 zettabytes being 1 billion terabytes of digital content in 2013 on the planet. Now, to give you a sense of scale, the Library of Congress is 10 terabytes. And so when I talk about there being 4 zettabytes of data on the content, I'm really talking about 400 million versions of the Library of Congress scattered throughout the planet. Now, some of them are probably cat photos or YouTube videos. But the challenge is how are we going to make sense of all that data, especially because it's going to double at least every 18 months. And so now let's pause and think about what the world of 2022 might look like, less than 6 years from now. By 2022, less than 6 years from now, estimates are conservatively 75, upwards of 300 billion network devices relative to only about 8 billion human beings on the face of the planet. And at that time, of those 8 billion human beings, about 85%, or 7 billion human beings, will be online. Right now, less than half the planet, a little bit about 40-45% have access to the internet. We're looking at a world that will have 85% of the planet will have access to the internet. And more importantly, there will be 96 zettabytes, 96 billion terabytes, or to put in context, 9.6 billion versions of the Library of Congress. Some estimate that this is actually more digital content than all human eyes see in the course of the year. Another statistic says it's twice all the conversations we've ever had as a species in terms of data. And pause to think about what that means. This means that right now we do web searches with keywords, but we really don't go past the second or third pages of results. I would submit to you that in less than 6 years, Google search will no longer work because we don't go past the second or third pages. We will be drowning in data and we will not be able to make sense of it in time to either seize on new opportunities or prevent bad things from happening. This is a challenge of what we're facing, and it's going to happen in the next few years. It's not something far off on the horizon. It's already happening now, and there may already be cases where there's information that may be useful for public service, for a civilian purpose, for a private sector organization, that they're not piecing it together just because there's so much of it, and you're trying to figure out what's important. So, how do we actually face this world we're going into, and where do we go? Well, the first thing I want you to think about is the importance of public service. And I want to tell you that public service is what we, the people, choose to do together. And there's a pause that I want you to think about there. Think about it. Back in the 1770s, when we were actually still fighting the revolution and trying to figure out what we wanted to be in terms of the United States, packet latency, the time that it took for a message to get between New York and DC, was about 3 days. And that was one way on horseback. But nowadays, it's milliseconds to get anywhere in the world to share a message. I mean, we're doing this right now over video. I'm in DC, you're in Atlanta. Other people may be more remotely distributed. We're actually communicating in ways that actually can go past geography. And equally, this will be recorded, so it actually goes past time as well. But I think this is important because really we need to think about that government was really, in the sense, created in the past for when you had constraints of distance. You had constraints of time. And I want to put out an interesting, challenging proposition, which is government is a 20th century term. And really what we want to embrace is this term called public service. And the public service includes 3 different dimensions. It includes members of the public who may choose to participate in making our nation better or in assisting. It may include people of the private sector partnerships, and it will include government workers. Now, again, since I don't have the advantage of seeing the audience, but I'll ask this question, how many of you have a smartphone? And if you do have a smartphone, how many of you would be willing to volunteer data on either air quality or water quality or transportation quality or energy quality if it would make your communities healthier or safer? And you knew for sure that that information would be kept private and kept anonymous. Think about the things that we'd be willing to volunteer to make our communities safer. And this isn't really abstract, actually. We've actually done this at the FCC. When I arrived in late 2013, in the past we had been paying for installations in different communities, almost like the Nielsen ratings, where people would volunteer to share information from their home on what their broadband connection speed was. Now, we had to pay for it. It was about $4 or $5 million a year. And we decided instead to crowdsource this, to see if people would be willing to volunteer what their broadband connection speed using a mobile app. And by sharing it, they could see what it was. It could inform the FCC, and it could help the FCC know if the telecom providers, if the ISPs, are really providing you the connection speed that they promised. Now, remember the events of 2013. And think about what success I might have saying, hi, I'm with the US government. Would you like to download an app that will monitor your broadband connection? Probably not going to be that successful. But what we did was we made the code open source, which means that anyone could look at what we were doing. And by design, we designed it so we didn't collect your IP address. By design, we didn't know who you were in a 5-mile radius, which meant for those people that actually checked the code, and there were different groups that did, they said, look, they baked in security by design. They baked in privacy by design. That got trust. Plus, our terms and conditions for the app were less than 2 pages. When was the last time you downloaded anything from the internet and had to agree to terms and conditions that were less than 2 pages? And so as a result, instead of it being something that was not adopted, we found out, and actually we were surprised, it was the 4th most downloaded app right behind Google Chrome. The public is interested in sharing data if it will make their livelihoods better, make their communities safer, if you can get their trust. And I think this is particularly key for CDC, because the question is, with the CDC, what are opportunities, if you can think about this broader definition of public service and not just government, that by making things more open and transparent and more interactive, maybe you can actually get people to volunteer data that might help inform your efforts when it comes to doing the business of public service. So, talking about Terra Incognita, the reason why I chose the definition of Terra Incognita for this is it's Latin for unknown land. It used to be back in ancient Rome, when they had a part of the map they didn't know what it was, they called it Terra Incognita. And I wanted to submit to you that everything we're facing with the internet, everything that's going on with cybersecurity, these are unknown lands as to where we're going. You already heard about the exponential change that's both happening and expected. And I would submit to you that the complexity of all the existing legacy IT infrastructures that we have, the more and more connected internet systems, and the fact that human actors have interesting behaviors make trying to do the business of cybersecurity and have something be 100% cyber secure probably near impossible. Now, I realize there are people that are going to try and tell you, I want something to be 100% secure. And I would say if you want something to be 100% secure on the internet, the best thing you can do is disconnect it from the internet, bury it underground, and make sure no human being ever touches it. Then you have a chance of it being 100% secure. The trade-off, of course, is it's not going to really be that useful or accessible. And so what we really need to think about is, instead of trying to say we want 100% security, we need to start thinking about resiliency. And the nice thing is, because usually when I'm talking to audiences, they aren't all from a public health background, I imagine the CDC will understand this and actually appreciate it a little bit more. Nobody would ever raise their hand and say, I never want to get sick again. We recognize that even with your best intentions, even with the best hygiene, the best vaccinations, the best antibiotics, the best health care, you still will get sick. But what we want to do is, just like in real public health, when it comes to cyber resiliency, how quickly can we spot interesting trends, odd behaviors, and figure out, is this a hardware issue? Is this a software issue? Is it someone trying to exploit the device or make it unsecure? Contain it, get it on a better path, and once it's better, release it from quarantine and go from there. That's a different path than saying something's 100% secure. And again, I think the audience that you all are with the CDC, you'll appreciate that we almost need a cyber epidemiology when it comes to the Internet of Everything. So, another sense of scale to give you is it's worth confronting the average Internet minute. And according to statistics, the average Internet minute In 2014, there were 204 million emails sent per minute globally. 4 million Google search queries were performed. 2.4 million pieces of Facebook content posted. 72 hours of new YouTube video per minute uploaded. So the good news is you're not going to run out of things to watch. And 48,000 iOS apps downloaded. And again, these are growing exponentially. They're not linear. To give you a sense of how they're growing exponentially, back in 2014, there were 72 hours of new YouTube video uploaded. Now there's more than 500 hours of new YouTube video uploaded in less than 2 years. Every minute, we're seeing 500 hours of video uploaded. And again, how are we going to make sense of it? How are we actually going to come through it? These are the interesting challenges we're facing. So, now there's the other side of the internet as well. I just gave you the good side, or how we're using it side, but let me give you another side as well. According to other statistics, in 2013, McAfee saw 200 new threat vectors per minute. FireEye said they found a new advanced persistent threat or malware every 3 minutes. The Department of Energy says they receive, on average, about 7,000 attacks per minute. Department of Defense says 85% of the emails they receive, and in a minute, they get about 13,800 nefarious emails with malware attachments within that minute. These too will double every 18 months or more. And so we're facing both the good side of the internet in terms of how we use it, how it makes us more connected, but also the side that it allows more attacks and more proliferation of attacks to occur as well. This is why it's Terra Incognita, for how we'll deal with it. So I want to give you sort of 3 principles on how we could best venture forth from this. As Jason mentioned, and I have to say that was a very humbling introduction, and I appreciate it. I usually like to set the bar low so I can later impress the audience, but thank you for the introduction. I was in Australia last year for about 5 weeks and got to meet with their ministers of defense, their ministers of justice, communications, and ask them as to what were going to be their strategies for the Internet of Things becoming the Internet of Everything. And the one interesting question I heard in Australia was, in the event that your internet-connected refrigerator or her internet-connected car or internet-connected toaster starts attacking a bank, and this is not made up. In fact, this has already happened. We've seen denial of service attacks that only use Internet of Things devices. Who's going to let your grandmother or your grandfather or your mother and father know that their appliance is attacking a bank? It's probably not going to be military. It's probably not going to be Homeland Security. It's probably not even going to be police or local law enforcement. Who is going to let that individual know that their device has been co-opted by someone to serve and do a cyber attack? And then what's the response? Do you quarantine it until it's better? Do you have to take it to the factory to get checked out? These are all questions that we've not asked. And I think we need to ask, because this train called the Internet of Things becoming the Internet of Everything, going from 14 billion devices on the face of the planet with only 7.3 billion human beings to upwards of 75 or more in less than 6 years. That train is headed for the same train, which is this increased risk of cyber threats. And if we don't think there's going to be a train wreck, again, we need to think twice, and we need to figure out how are we going to survive in this era, and it can't be assuming that things will be 100% secure. And so this might be why we need to think about, again, cyber resiliency, much like we do with public health. And so, as I mentioned, public service is not just a thing that is done by government. Public service can be done by members of the public. Public service can be done by members of the private sector, public sector, academia, nonprofits. And I think that's one of the things that we need to think about when we think about these new solutions. Now, the other thing that I saw when I was in Taiwan as an Eisenhower Fellow is I saw that most of these devices that will make up the Internet of Everything were based on what's called industrial control points. These are things that were in factories. And the assumption was the only way you ever accessed them in the past was you had to get through a guard that may have had a gun, and you had to show a badge. And so security to make sure the right people were accessing it was done through physical security. The challenge is we're now connecting these things to the Internet. You don't have the guard. You don't have to show a gate. You don't have to go through it. And so actually there is less security with these industrial endpoints that we are now making Internet of Things devices than what traditionally has been on the Internet. So again, we have some interesting challenges that we have to address. We have to figure out how are we going to survive in this. Now, there's the other side too, which is the do-it-yourself movement. If you're not familiar with what the Makers Movement is, I would encourage after this afternoon or tomorrow, Google the Makers Movement and learn about it, because this is going to be a trend that will impact us all, and probably in particular with doing public health in rural areas as well as areas that are hard to get to globally. And the idea with the makers movement is things that used to only be available for nation states to do or large corporations can now be done inexpensively by individuals. You may have heard of a thing called Raspberry Pi. There's a thing called Raspberry Zero. These are circuit boards you can get, in some cases, for less than $5 and have computing power that used to only be available to a large nation state, say, in the 1980s. In fact, your smartphone, according to some people, if you have a smartphone, has more computing power than President Reagan had in 1981 through the Pentagon. And that the next 1 billion people on the face of the planet that will get a smartphone will probably get that computing power for less than $45. So to give you an example of the makers movement, these are 3 individuals. They're actually in Nigeria. And what they did for less than $45 using a Raspberry Pi and other devices, they actually built a community urine power generator so the community could read at night. And they did it for less than $45. That was truly transformative for the community. Similarly, in this other photo here, using an SMS flip phone and some other devices, they built a baby monitor that could actually, for less than $60, monitor 20 different vital signs and use SMS texting to share those vital signs with any doctor in the world. So that's the good side of the makers movement. But the other thing to think about with the makers movement is what the impact's going to be when things don't go right. Technology is amoral. It's how we choose how to use it that decides whether it's good or bad. Another thing to think about is get ready for what's called machine learning, or what some people call artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence, it's probably on the Gartner hype cycle, and it's going to probably crash, and we're going to realize what really works and what doesn't work. But I want to share that with you because it's on the horizon. In some respects, there are already some interesting proof points. In 2013, there was a competition to see if anyone could write an algorithm that would grade papers as good as a third-grade teacher. That was to find the same grammar mistakes or find the same mathematical errors and correct it for the student. And for $60,000, actually someone won that competition. It was a hedge fund trader that had some free time. 2014, Xerox comes out with a copier that will take a handwritten test with answers and questions and actually grade it for the teacher with no a priori programming. And again, it's at the third grade level, so we're basically doing basic math, basic sentences, but that shows what's possible. Now right now it's still more expensive than teachers, so teachers aren't out of a job, but it shows what's possible. 2015, a company actually elects to its board of directors an algorithm and gives it voting rights. Similarly, in 2015, IBM Watson and other AIs are being tested to see which meetings you should go to in your organization, which meetings you should skip, and if you do go to those meetings, who should you take with you to have the most productive conversations. 2016, the state of California is actually testing right now an AI in which you feed in information about a case, and the AI is actually what sets bail, not a judge. And there's actually some good in that, in the sense that that AI is not looking at things that are not relevant to the case. It's not looking at your height or your weight or your gender or your race. It's just looking at the facts of the case to help set the bail. Also in 2016, there's actually another competition now to see if anyone can write an AI that will be able to answer real estate law as good as a real estate lawyer. Real estate law is pretty much rule-based. And right now, it's about 80% accurate. And so this raises interesting questions, not necessarily about how we replace humans, but how do we pair the strengths that humans have at being able to do things creatively and ask why, with the strengths that an AI can do, which can be to make things and decisions at scale. And so it's really about how we bring these things together. And we've already seen this before. Already, when it comes to cancer or heart anomalies, we have algorithms that actually can detect cancer or detect heart anomalies 95% or better than most doctors. If you're in a hospital that's not one of the top hospitals in the world, you may want the algorithm versus just a doctor. Now, you want the doctor too, because it will spot it and then tip and cue the doctor to ask more questions. And so this is the world we need to think about in which these two things are coexisting. Now, I know some people worry about, will AI actually put us all out of jobs? I don't think it will. And in fact, the reason why I share that is to think about how we can move things forward and actually begin to think about how we actually work together. An interesting world. I think someone is advancing my slides for me. So we'll move forward. So as we think about this world we're going into, it really is about how we can actually bring humans together to monitor diagnostics and ensure that machines themselves aren't compromised. With artificial intelligence, it's like a 5-year-old. We don't teach a 5-year-old specifically, here's subject, here's verb, here's object. We just expose the 5-year-old to enough language so that at the end of the day, after they've been exposed to enough language, they say, I'm going to walk to school today. And when you ask the 5-year-old, why did you say it that way versus another way, the 5-year-old will tell you, well, it's just because I never heard it said any other way. And that's really why the value of machine learning is there. So finally, thinking about this world we're going into, it's worth remembering in 1969 there was only 6 nodes that made up this ARPANET. By 1982, we now had it across the country. We had transatlantic, transpacific cables. By 1993, the good news is Europe and the US are now connected, and the rest of the world is beginning to get connected. By 2017, the interesting thing is they actually gave up trying to draw on the map the connections amongst the internet. And that Latin up there, that Latin is in these areas lie scorpions, or danger zones. Because the thing is, the good news is the rest of the world is getting connected, but it's raising questions about national boundaries. Where is a packet of information on the internet? Is it where it's sent from, or where it's received by? 2010, they gave up actually trying to draw a map of the internet to actually show where things were, and actually gave up trying to actually show it on a geography. And I think that's an interesting way where we're going. So all these questions about how AI, how the Internet of Things, it's going to make complicated how we do cybersecurity and cyber resiliency. And to give you a sense of the scale, the Internet of Everything, Internet Protocol version 4, which was how we previously used to address numbers on the Internet, was 4.3 billion addresses, 2 to the 32. We actually ran out of these addresses about 10 months ago. But if you take all the Internet addresses that we had 10 months ago and put them in a beach ball, the Internet we're going to adopt is called Internet Protocol version 6, 2 to 128. And it's worth thinking about what is a comparable size object that is that Internet Protocol version 6. The Internet that you knew is the size of the beach ball. The Internet that you will know over the next 6 years will be the size of the sun. This is not linear change. This is exponential change. And it's going to strain both private sector and public sector organizations. So I'll leave one thought. And again, this is a photo of our planet. This time it was actually taken in 2013 when NASA's probe Cassini turned around and took that picture as it passed by Saturn. Carl Sagan said in 1994, look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. Everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. We're going to need more change agents for exponential times. This is going to call into questions about how we do cybersecurity, how IT is baked into mission efforts, and ultimately how we do public service. And with that, I thank you for your opportunity. Jason, I'm available for questions, and I appreciate it.
Wow, thank you so much, David. That was, you covered an unbelievable amount of ground in that presentation. If anybody has any questions, there should be a module there in front of you on your screen that says questions, comments. Please type those in there, and David will be able to see them and respond.
Hopefully.
So while we, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to say, hopefully there's some questions. Do you have one, Jason?
Yeah, sure. I'll start it off. So again, you covered a lot of ground here, David, and touched on so many of the things that are introducing significant, if not radical, change. One of the things I was interested in, I didn't know if you had any data or information on, was sort of the trend in adoption of Internet of Things in homes.
Sure.
Right, whether it's so I don't even have to explain it. So do you have any sense for where that's going?
It's happening without us even knowing it. In fact, I think there was one statistic I saw that that you have a 50% chance this year to buy an appliance and not realize it has an internet connection to it. And so a lot of this is you are buying Internet of Things devices and not even realizing it. But it's happening partly because device manufacturers want to be able to deliver you more content. They want to be able to deliver you more ads or things like that. So, or they just want to actually the information associated with your data. And so I think this raises very interesting questions about how can we as the public stand up and say, yes, look, there may be cases where I'm willing to get something for free, like a free app or a free service on my television or my car, but only if I've actually given implicit consent as to that data. And there may be other choices where I want to actually turn that resostat back and maybe not share all my data. Maybe I don't want to share everything I'm watching on television, or maybe I don't want to share every place my car goes, or everything I buy and put in my refrigerator. And so I actually think there needs to be a conversation about how consumers have a resostat. So they can say, well, maybe I don't want to share all that information, which means maybe I don't get the app for free or the service for free, but maybe I'm paying $3 a month. And I'm okay with paying $3 a month because I'm not giving up all my data. And so it's happening much faster than we realize. But it's about a conversation about how do we make sure it's a conversation that's happening across the entire public versus by ourselves.
Thanks, David. Do you see the question down there?
I see a comment that says, this is scary, this is the fact, but I don't see the rest of the question. So maybe
if you click on it, it'll expand, but it says, yeah, this is scary. And is the fact that we are more plugged in a good thing?
Well, that is a great question. And again, I don't think it's inherently good or bad. I think, again, technology is amoral. And what do I mean by that? You know, back in prehistoric times, fire can cook meals. It can warm us. It can provide a space for people to gather. But fire can also burn and hurt and kill. The wheel can get us to places. It can move goods. It can do commerce. But the wheel can also be weapons of war and also kill as well. And so tools and technology are just an extension of what we humans choose to do. And there can be cases where you design something for good only to find out that it's used for bad, or vice versa. You design it for bad, it turns out to be from good. In fact, we probably know that given the world in which we deal with. I mean, why is there a bioterrorism preparedness response program? Again, technologies are extensions of human choices. So the fact that we are more plugged in is amoral itself, but the question is, what are we going to choose to do now that we are more plugged in? I mean, in some respects, it could bring us closer together. There are examples of where actually classes are taught where they don't reveal to the participants on the class, or it's an online course. They participate for about 6 months, and at the end of 6 months, they reveal that half of the class was Palestinian and half of the class was Israeli. And that changes their views about the tensions that they have because they worked together before you reveal that content. That's a good thing. But equally, we've talked about all these cyber risks, or the fact that a country half a world away can actually interfere with what an organization or what a government is doing. And so it's the choices we humans make that ultimately determine a good or a bad outcome. And I think that's the conversation we need to have, which is what choices do we want, and how can we empower you to have that awareness? I mean, you may choose to be less connected, or you may choose to be more connected and you're willing to take what comes with it. But it's a choice as opposed to something that's forced on you. And I think that's the key of what we need to discuss.
Yeah, you know, I think I would completely agree with you, David. Even though I think that perspective, that reality could be, if not done well, overwhelming, given the number of choices one would have to make and the discrimination and the dozens, if not hundreds, of resostats that one might need to have in order to dial back everything. But I think you're absolutely right in the sense that it really is up to us to be in control or to manage appropriately how we interact with those things and how those things interact with each other and how those things end up communicating back to, to their mothership,
Right. Well, and I think, and to sort of build on what you're saying, and I agree it could be overwhelming because we already talked about overwhelming data. Right. What would be fun is to see if a nonprofit or a public group could release an open source AI, artificial intelligence, that you can have a conversation with it as to what you want done with your data. So instead of you having to go into Facebook, LinkedIn, Google, whatever your social media platform is, and set all the settings yourself, because that's really hard, and guess what? They're going to change the settings. And the trouble is, it's also not a resostat. It's basically you have access to Facebook or you're not. If you don't opt into the bare minimum, you have no access. Instead, if you could express to this AI that is your own personal AI, look, here are the things I'm willing to share. Maybe it says, are you willing to share your data with Google when you say no? And it comes back and says, are you willing to share your data with Google in the event of a car accident? Well, okay, maybe I'm going to be willing to do that because then it's important. Or are you willing to share your data in the event that I detect that your heart rate has dropped below 40 beats a minute? Okay, so it's a conversation, much like you would have a conversation with a person, as opposed to trying to set all the settings on a computer interface. Plus, it's this third party that is actually your AI. Now, it has to be open source, so that one, you can make sure there are no backdoors for any other purposes. But then two, by making it open source, you could allow people to build extensions that would connect with other services. And then when it becomes almost like your own personal custodian that says, are you willing to share this data or not? And you make choice trade-offs. And that becomes more of a conversation as opposed to trying to set everything individually for each individual platform that's out there. Are there other questions?
Yeah, more questions from the group. There's a lot of content here.
So one of the things that I think is worth thinking about, again, on the question about what is good versus bad. You know, we were talking about the makers movement, and we were talking about how people increasingly in rural areas or impoverished areas can do things that used to only be available to large nation states. And I think that's going to be huge and game-changing when it comes to doing commerce, when it comes to doing health, when it comes to doing education. And I have a lot of hope that possibly you could actually uplift Africa if we're willing to make the investment and help them with the remixing. Now, at the same time, however, it's worth thinking about that the Mumbai terrorist attacks that happened. The Mumbai terrorist attacks used web searches. They used GPS. They used social media, unfortunately, to plan their attacks, coordinate their attacks, and then actually, unfortunately, figure out who they were going to assassinate. And so, again, it's an example of the things that you and I use on a daily basis for either benign, good purposes or just posting cat photos. Unfortunately, it's a double-edged sword. And I think this is why we're seeing strains and we're seeing a loss of public trust, not because government's doing anything different. In some respects, what's happening is we were designed for an era that was not exponential. But we in government are now actually facing exponential change. And the question is, can we keep checks and balances and move forward at exponential speed? I actually worry that if we don't have this conversation now and figure out solutions over the next 10 years, we may end up showing that in a rapidly changing world, being a dictatorship or an oligarchy is better than trying to do representative government because it takes time and because we have checks and balances. And I don't want to become a dictatorship or an oligarchy because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But we need to figure out how can we do the business of being a republic, being a representative democracy, and at the same time be able to adapt to this exponential era. And so part of that might be give more ability to make decisions, give more ability for the public to opt in to the public themselves to allow us to move with speed. So I see another question, so let me move the mouse.
Yeah, if you click on it, it expands.
Got it, yes. So on the topic of cyber epidemiology, so the question is, so what might it look like or what it could look like? So it doesn't exist. It's actually something I've been proposing for a while. Think about how we currently do epidemiology. We're basically trying to do disease surveillance. We're trying to spot if something's going on, if there's going to be a new outbreak of swine flu or something like that. We'd want to do the same thing for the internet. And the different things that are connected to the internet that provide security, like a firewall done by FireEye, Palo Alto, or an antivirus software by McAfee or Symantec, or other things like that. In a lot of cases, those device manufacturers are getting data at scale from all the different places where they have that piece of software or that hardware. Now, they're not sharing it because right now there is no safe harbor to share it. And really, I don't think we need to have all that specific data. We don't need to know it specifically came from this company. But what we want is, could they de-identify, abstract the context, much like how the states share data with us at the federal level. And then as a result, we could have a situational awareness that's updated daily. Right now, the best sort of gold standard for the health of the internet comes out once a year. It's called the Verizon Breach Report. And it's only done once a year, and it's not the entire internet. It's just a subset of companies. And what it does is it tells you what the current trends are with cybersecurity. But you can imagine cybersecurity threats and trends will change a lot every 12 months. And to wait another year to update it, it's really hard. Plus, I've talked to Fortune 500 and Fortune 5000 companies. And unless you are a defense contractor, bank, or a tech company, on average, for every $1 billion in revenue, they only have one IT security person. In fact, some of them actually said they envy the different requirements we have for IT security in the U.S. government, which I know those of us that do it, we sometimes like it and sometimes it's a challenging relationship. But it's because at least we have an impetus and a case made to us to try and be secure. Their challenge is they go to their CEO, they go to their board of directors, and they say, well, I don't think we're at risk. Why would anyone try to attack us? To which my response is, are you a publicly traded company? And if they say yes, I say, okay, so you're publicly traded. What happens if I go to the stock market, short your stock, hack your company, and then reveal that you're hacked, and rake in a profit as your stock dives? And that makes them go, oh. but they still have the challenge of how do they make the case to their board of directors. And so until we get an open cyber epidemiology that is updated on a daily basis, what are the threats? Which sectors are being targeted more? Is it more academia? Is it banks? Is it technology companies? What are the general trends? It is going to be hard for private sector companies to make their case as to why they need to invest more in IT security. There's another dimension of that too, which is right now studies have shown if it costs more than 26 cents for a product, we consumers aren't willing to pay for a more secure product. That is the tipping point in which we say, oh, it's not worth it. So we actually aren't even asking for vendors to bake security into their products, and so we shouldn't be surprised they're not doing it. And so until we get a better situational awareness about the health, I mean, how can we ever fight the quote-unquote cyber threats? How could you ever address a disease without the equivalent of epidemiology? We need the same thing here. And so again, that's why I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to CDC, because I think what CDC does has a huge opportunity to have a conversation for how we do public service and particularly cyber resiliency going forward. Other questions? Now, if people are feeling really scared or really dark right now, I will say it's worth thinking about that we've always faced challenges and strains. If you were in England in the year 1940, it probably looked very dark. But we got through that and we actually figured out creative solutions. Times of challenges and times of stress are actually the times when we humans come together. In some respects, I think that's actually when the different frictions across groups sort of dissolve and we work together. And so I still hold out hope. And this is actually not that different from things we've done in the past. When we made the change from being agricultural societies to industrial, that was a huge shift. Instead of working 24/7 like you did on a farm, people started working in factories. Now, it wasn't all good. I mean, working 12-hour days, not great. Plus, it was very repetitive. And it's interesting because some historians say that the way that people dealt with that sort of psychological stress of shifting from being agricultural to being industrial was they dealt with it through gin and alcohol. And then equally, when people made the leap from being industrial to the post-World War II society where you didn't have to work 12 hours a day, you only needed to work an 8-hour day and do a 5-day week, that was stressful too because people didn't know what to do with their free time. They actually had some interesting questions. And so the way we dealt with that was we dealt with that through sitcoms and TV dinners. And so we are going through another shift, and maybe we're going to deal with it through conversations on the internet, social media, who knows. But these are interesting questions that we need to ask, which is how are we going to deal with these challenges going forward?
Yeah, you know, David, as you've been talking, I've been trying to think about recent analogs. And so it reminds me a little bit, some of your talk reminds me a little bit of in the 50s and the 60s with Ralph Nader and Unsafe at Any Speed, right? So that was a major moment that changed the automotive industry, right? Made a major shift toward safety of the car itself, and maybe introducing a variety of other environmental safety features that improved or reduced mortality really and injury. And so I'm wondering if at any point looking forward, are we going to get to that space where some fairly significant changes need to happen in the broad industry that also includes some kind of awareness building, teaching, training of the individual who is now responsible for all this?
I agree 100%. And that only came once the awareness of the challenges and threats existed. I mean, if we didn't have that open conversation, seatbelts only came around in the 1970s. Nowadays, who would imagine not having seatbelts? Similarly, anti-lock brakes, fairly recent, airbags. And so until you actually have the data on the risk, and I think this is part of the challenges, in a lot of cases, after the bioterrorism program, I was in Afghanistan and later with the national security community. The challenge is I think we overclassified these cyber threats, thinking that we could solve them without the public knowing. And I think now we almost owe it to the public, which is can we find a way that doesn't necessarily reveal methods and means or deal things that are going to make you stress too much. But until you know, like you said, the hazards associated with driving a vehicle and then the need to have a seatbelt, to have anti-lock brakes and airbags, how are we going to address the things that we need to do in cybersecurity as well? But I will say again, anyone who takes on a role as a CIO in which someone says they want something to be 100% secure and it's connected to the internet, you probably want to disconnect it from the internet, bury it underground, and make sure no human being touches it, or have a risk-based conversation with your leadership about, look, what are the things that we really want to focus on? Are we willing to have that connected to the internet? Maybe not. Maybe we disconnect it. But have that be. In fact, it's interesting. Taiwan and Singapore have both decided that for a lot of their government functions, those agencies will not be connected to the internet, which I'm not endorsing. I think that is a losing proposition. If you want to remain in touch with what the public needs, you have to connect to the internet, but that does show what other countries have decided as their solution. Other questions?
Yeah, other questions from folks?
If I could see people's facial reactions, I could ask questions.
I know it would be easy. So I'll ask another one, and more
Sorry,
asking you to.
There's a question in the questions comments section from Catherine.
I think
we
just got
addressed that one. Yep. About cyber epidemiology.
Yep. So you had another question, Jason?
Yeah. So while we wait for some people to get their thoughts together, so I find fascinating this scenario you painted early about an appliance attacking a bank. It's surreal. It's almost absurd. But maybe you could expand a little bit on that example. You said it was factual, so.
It's factual. It's actually happened. So denial of service attacks, what's called DDoS attacks, or distributed denial of service attacks, have been doubling every year in terms of volume. I think we recently surpassed 650 gigabits per second in a denial of service attack. And that's only possible when you, instead of just using, the way these work is a attacker will recruit many different machines and then tell them to talk to a web service or a web device or some other IP address and say, just flood it with information so it can't respond to anybody. So it looks like your site is down even though it's not. And what's happened is in the last 6 months, we went from having a year ago about 300 gigabits per second. We now have upwards of 650, so it's doubled in just a year. And looking at it, they said, yeah, it was appliances. It was internet-connected appliances that had been recruited by an attacker to flood a certain IP address with way too much information. And that raises interesting questions because at what point in time is it not just flooding a certain IP address, but maybe you're flooding a satellite link or you're flooding a transatlantic or trans-Pacific cable such that you can't even get communications across one country to another country. And that's not science fiction. That's happening now.
Yeah. It's amazing.
So, yeah, but again, we've been here before. And that's where I talk about the importance of change agents. So when I arrived at the FCC, there had been 9 CIOs in 8 years, which is always a good sign for CIO number 10. And the team, to their credit, when I first met with them, they said, we're looking at our watches. We're not exactly sure you're going to be here past the next year. And so I actually turned around to them and said, well, where do we want to go? How are we going to deal with the fact that we're facing these challenges? We had 207 different IT systems all on good to do at the time. But when you play that over 15 years, you now have way more systems than you have people and money to maintain them. And again, coming from what I knew in my intelligence background, I said, this is not going to be the most secure to try and maintain everything on premise. And so we made a goal of in 2 years or less to move everything either to a public cloud or a commercial service provider. And that was going to be hard. With the existing team, and we didn't get any additional money. And I'm sure it was culture change for all of them. If they were here, I think they would tell you it was a massive change, and we're still learning about the changes that we've made. But we showed that we could move things to the public cloud first. We made some incremental moves. There was one case where we had a system that was a 15-year-old consumer help desk. If you had a complaint against one of the telephone or TV providers, you let the FCC know, but you had to download a PDF form. You had to figure out what the right PDF form was, and then fax it or scan it back to the FCC, and then we deal with it. And we're like, well, we need to update that. The quotes to update it were about 3.2 million and about 14 to 18 months. And one of our change agents said, well, why don't we go straight to this software as a service product? We can get there in less than 60 days, and on top of it, it's only going to cost $450,000 for the first year, $100,000 going on. So less than 1/6 the price. And that 60 days did happen, and then it took another 4 months for us to socialize with our different stakeholders to release it, but still in less than 6 months as opposed to 18 months. So also less than 1/2 the time, we had a new system at 1/6 the price. And then it came this time last year over Labor Day that the team of change agents at the FCC, we decided anything else we still had on premise, we literally piled into 7 different moving vans. There was a police escort. It escorted it to West Virginia, and we either brought those things up line with a commercial service provider or we retired them and went straight to a public cloud provider. And as a result, after that, in the last year, instead of spending 85% of our budget just to maintain systems, it's now less than 50%. More importantly, however, if you come to us with a new requirement and it's been mapped out, instead of taking 6 or 7 months to get you a new system, we can have a prototype in less than 48 hours, and we can probably launch it in 10 weeks. So what I really think about this change is we will figure out ways to do it. However, we have to recognize it's going to involve all of us. I often tell my team, I know I have blind spots. I love it when people point it out. In fact, I reward it. There's a Harvard Business Review article that says the best leaders recognize they have blind spots. It's called In Praise of Incomplete Leadership. And so it really is a team effort to figure out how we're going to survive versus looking for any one person to have all the answers. Any other questions?
Yeah, any other questions out there? All right, so I have one last question for you, David.
Sure.
And thanks so much for entertaining all my questions. So I know the FCC has been or had been fairly involved with open internet and net neutrality, right? So I'm wondering what, and if you can't speak to it, that's fine. But just curious, so what might be or is the FCC's position with regard to the things that you're talking about today?
So yeah, open internet. Actually, let me tell you first about some of the stories of open internet. So prior to open internet, probably the most controversial topic discussed at FCC was a wardrobe malfunction that happened at a Super Bowl halftime event, in which we received about 1.1 million comments. Yeah. Net neutrality, obviously, a lot more interested in people providing comments. What was interesting is the way we work is we have public commenting periods in which the commissioners will give a draft proposal, people get 60 days to comment, and if you want, if it's really important, you can do another 60 days. And so this was so important, we had 2 60-day comment periods. And we had a 17 going on 18-year-old system that was on-premise. And when people started sharing comments, we saw a slight uptick. In fact, there was a comedian that actually did a segment that people might remember on Comedy Central. That increased the number of comments from being 5,000 to 25,000 a day, but that still wasn't a lot. What was interesting, however, was the individual invited the trolls to also give comments. And trolls are individuals on the internet that are out to make interesting times for everybody else, and interesting in quotation marks. So some people realized with the old system we had that if they filed a comment and then searched for it a split second later, and they kept on doing this over and over again, it would tie up the search index so that it couldn't respond to anybody else. And so in some respects, it was a denial of service attack on the databases. And so that happened, and we were live with an 18-year-old system that people had probably forgotten how to update because it was 18 years old. And to the team's credit, in less than 24 hours, they figured out a workaround to separate the search index from the search results in real time where everything was going on. So that was our first adventure. When we get to the end of 60 days, there's another uptick. Now, interesting thing there is they tried again to do that little sort of interesting behavior of tying up the search index, and it didn't work this time because we had made the update. So instead, what someone did was they went on Reddit with the name of Darth Lurker, which I'm sure is a very benign name. But they went on Reddit and they claimed at 1 o'clock in the morning, right before we were supposed to close our first 60-day comment, that the FCC had deleted all the comments and everyone should check to make sure their comments were still there. And so they, in some respects, crowdsourced a distributed denial of service attack. And sure enough, starting at 3 a.m. in the morning, we saw a huge uptick, not just from humans, but also from machines. And to the team's credit again, they figured out a workaround in less than 12 hours to deal with that huge volume, and everything was okay. And the FCC said, no, look, we didn't delete anybody's comments. So that was the first 60 days of this controversial time. And by that point in time, we had actually exceeded 1.7 million comments. So we had passed that previous controversial issue, 1.7 million comments on this issue. We had another 60 days. And again, it trickled in until the last 3 days, where in the last 3 days alone of the final commenting period, we got 2.3 million comments. Now, what was interesting is several of those comments looked exactly the same with the same exact typos. We made them public so you can analyze them yourselves. And the top 5 IP addresses that were sending them to us were AWS. Amazon Web Services. Now, I'm pretty sure it was not AWS giving us their comments. I'm pretty sure IBM Watson was not giving us his comments. But I think people had recruited bots to submit comments on behalf of humans. And so I share that because that's something to think about. What does that mean when we're trying to make decisions on the internet where people can flood certain perceptions, or they can even make it look like a human's doing something when maybe they did in the past, or they fed in things, or maybe it's just an AI. That was a very interesting experience that I think we're going to see more and more of on interesting issues. With regards to the Internet of Things, the interesting thing is there's no one agency that oversees it all. FCC's jurisdiction is anything wired or wireless, so it would be the spectrum that connected to these devices, but it wouldn't be the devices themselves per se. And so this may be one of the things that, again, when the Constitution was created, nobody thought to assign health care to anybody, and so it's a state right versus a federal right. Similarly, the founders, probably no one thought about who's going to do this Internet of Things, Internet of Everything. And so it's probably going to require a deep conversation about what do the states get to do, what does the local level get to do, what does the federal government get to do, and again, which agency is in charge. And so that's why I'm trying to say government, maybe that's really a 20th century term, and we really need to think about public service, about what do we do to empower the public directly. If they want to share data, they can. For example, like they shared information on broadband connection speeds, and we ended up being the fourth most downloaded app for a while. Can we allow the public to help inform what we do with the Internet of Things, Internet of Everything, and as a result, get better outcomes?
Great, thanks, David. That's a perfect way to bring it right back around. It's perfect.
Right. Well,
so any other questions? Yep. I suspect there won't be. So I want to thank everyone for joining this afternoon, and especially thank Dr. David Bray for taking the time out from his busy schedule up in DC to talk to us about the Internet of Everything. Thank you so much, David. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Jason, and anytime. Also, if anyone's ever in DC from the CDC, happy to host them at the FCC.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you. Take care.